On Saturday, the University of Minnesota beat Penn State 31-26. And God, it was a great game. Both teams were undefeated. Well, actually now, Penn State is now 8-1, and the University of Minnesota Golden Gophers are 9-0. And it's a cool story because according to the college football playoff rankings going into that game, Minnesota was number 17 overall, and Penn State was number 4. And man, I'm happy for Minnesota fans. This is a big upset for them on paper. I think they were all expecting to win. But I used to live in Maple Grove, Minnesota, and Minnesota. I don't have a favorite team. It was easy to not be a fan of the Minnesota Golden Gophers because they stunk. They were terrible. They were awful. And I want to credit the crowd in Minnesota. It's been a long time, like years, that the fans of this football team have wanted to be good, and they haven't been. They brought in this new coach, PJ Fleck. He's been a cornerstone and really the reason why they're turning things around. But the crowd in Minnesota on Saturday, Minnesota hosting Penn State, they showed up. They were loud, and the team fed off their energy. The people in that stadium they showed up all game, loud, cheering. They showed up for their team and allowed their team to show up for them in big moments. It was so cool, and I just really enjoyed the chaotic, fun football game we saw between Penn State and Minnesota. Now, Minnesota's quarterback, Tanner Morgan, oh my gosh. He was accurate. He made wonderful decisions. He was not safe at all. Tanner Morgan threw the ball downfield. Big completion after big completion. 40 yards, 30 yards. I was like, what? This guy, Tanner Morgan, is shredding Penn State. And it's really cool. He completed 18 of his 20 passes. So he had 2 incomplete passes the entire game. He had 339 yards, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions. And what's crazy about this game is he had 3 touchdowns and only 2 incomplete passes. He had more touchdown passes than he had incompletions. That's unbelievable. To me, I'm not a big stats guy, you know me. And the fact that he did that in the biggest game of the year for his football team is just so cool. And I'm really curious. I don't know if he's an NFL quarterback or not, but Tanner Morgan jumped onto my radar on Saturday, and I was like, wow, this is just it's phenomenal. I just was so impressed with him. Minnesota was a better team, though, just all around. They were more physical, and they were better coached on Saturday. There was a goal line stand where Penn State started with the ball on the 9-yard line. They ran the ball 3 times in a row. They made very little progress. Then with a 4th and goal on the 4-yard line, Penn State went for it. They threw the ball. Minnesota knocked it away in the end zone. Penn State was stopped on 4 consecutive first and goal, 2nd and goal, 3rd and goal, and 4th and goal. 4 consecutive downs. Minnesota held their ground and got a turnover on downs. Now, it's really funny. In contrast, Penn State couldn't score on the goal line. Minnesota was perfect in goal-to-go situations. Again, let's talk about another stat that excites me. Minnesota's 19 for 19. They have 19 touchdowns in all 19 goal-to-go situations they've had this year. Every time Minnesota's had a 1st and goal this year, they've found a way to turn it into a touchdown. That's unbelievable. The end of the drive is always, if they have a 1st and goal, so far this year, through 9 games, Minnesota, every single time, has converted and finished that drive with a touchdown. That's unbelievable. And Minnesota also put Penn State in a really, I think, a foreign and uncomfortable situation they hadn't dealt with at all this year. The first 8 games of the year, Penn State led 84% of the time. Minnesota took the lead early and didn't look back. Minnesota led most of the game against Penn State, and I think that put some pressure on Penn State and really caused them to struggle. And I think it really helped when Minnesota outcoached Penn State. There's 2 scenarios I want to discuss for Minnesota. I want to contrast, Minnesota's coaching with PJ Fleck and Penn State's coaching. Minnesota and PJ Fleck, the head coach of Minnesota, had a situation where his situational game management really, really impressed me. His understanding of the situation and how to handle it was phenomenal. It was 4th and 16, and Minnesota took an intentional delay of game penalty to give them more room for their punter. They backed up another 5 yards to help their punter get more room. They punted the ball away and ended up pinning Penn State on their own 9-yard line. They flipped the field. They made it very difficult for Penn State, and that's a large degree because of the situational game management by PJ Fleck saying, hey, we want to pin them deep. Let's take a 5-yard penalty and move us back a little bit to give our punter more room. I was really impressed with that. Now, Penn State made decisions that cost them. Penn State left 4 points on the board. I understand that Penn State lost by 5. But in my opinion, those 4 points could have been 5. And I think we could have had a 31-31 tie game if Penn State had handled things a little bit differently. There was a point in the game where Penn State scored a touchdown and made the game 19-24. And they chose to go for a 2-point conversion to try to make it a 3-point game, and they failed. So the score was left at 19-24. If they'd gone for the extra point and just taken the 1 point, it could have been a 24-20 game. That 1 point would come back to haunt them later. Later, it was 31-19, and it was 4th and goal for Penn State. And if Penn State had had 1 more point, they could have kicked a field goal and made it a 1-possession game. If it was 20-31, they could have kicked a field goal and made it 23-31 and an 8-point difference, making it saying for Penn State, all they would have needed is a touchdown and a 2-point conversion, and they could have tied up the game. Instead, because they chose to go for 2 earlier in the game, they had to go for it now because there was no chance of making it a 1-score game with just a field goal. They needed a touchdown on 4th and goal. They got stopped, and it cost them. They failed on 4th and goal. It could have been. So there was a situation where 2 times Penn State, they cost themselves by going for it earlier in the game in the middle of the third quarter. They went for a 2-point conversion. And that later came back to haunt them by forcing them to go for it on 4th and goal rather than being able to take the easy points with a chip shot field goal and making it a 1-possession game. Penn State mismanaged those situations, trying to chase points earlier than they needed to, and cost them a chance to tie up the game because they did go down and score a touchdown later, which would have been, my point is they scored a touchdown and they had an opportunity for a field goal and they had an opportunity for an extra point. All of the drives were there, but they didn't take points when they needed to, and it cost them not 4, but 5 points and possibly a tie game with Minnesota. I'm so happy for Minnesota fans, man. I am. I just want to discuss their head coach, PJ Fleck. PJ Fleck was hired in 2017, and he was brought over from Western Michigan. And it's really interesting. PJ Fleck, after his first year in Minnesota, a lot of guys transferred out of the program. They said, we don't want to be a part of this, and left. And PJ Fleck's attitude is, okay, I am who I am. I know I'm not for everybody, and if you don't want to be a part of this, no problem. I'll find guys who want to be a part of our program and want to work. And some people think he's a crazy man. Like some people in Minnesota even are like, PJ, well, I guess Minnesota's probably less likely, but people in the Big Ten that I know are like, PJ Fleck's insane. The fact that they think he's a crazy man because he talks about work and he's got all these sayings and all these phrases and yada, yada. And he's, I think, very demanding. He expects a high level of effort from his team. But I love that he doesn't apologize for who he is, and he's succeeding. PJ Fleck is 9-0, turning around an impossible situation at Minnesota. It's phenomenal. And the coolest story I can think of to explain PJ Fleck and really kind of celebrate who he is as a person is he used to be the head coach at Western Michigan. And when he was hired at Western Michigan, he called up a guy named Kirk Ciarrocca. Kirk Ciarrocca is now the offensive coordinator at Minnesota. At the time, they'd known each other from a past job at Rutgers. And he called up Kirk Ciarrocca and said, hey, I want you to be my offensive coordinator at Western Michigan. And at the time, Kirk Ciarrocca, it's spelled with a C, but you call it Ciarrocca. It's very weird. Whatever. I'm saying his name, though. He pronounced it. I found a video on YouTube where he said his own name. I made sure. I'm doing the best I can to pronounce it right. But Kirk Ciarrocca said at the time he had an offer from Western Michigan and then 2 other coaching job offers that both paid more money than PJ Fleck at Western Michigan was able to offer. And Kirk Ciarrocca went home to his wife, and they had a discussion about it. And Kirk Ciarrocca's wife said, honey, you have always said that PJ Fleck would be a great head coach. And so Kirk Ciarrocca took less money to work with PJ Fleck at Western Michigan. And it just speaks to me how PJ Fleck is such an infectious leader of men and a great leader of men that Kirk Ciarrocca was willing to take less money to work with him. That's how good of a leader and how good of a person he is. People matter. And to me, PJ Fleck is an elite leader of men and an incredible influence on that program. And this example the win over Penn State is a prime example of the way that PJ Fleck is turning things around at the University of Minnesota. It makes me so happy. And I really enjoyed watching that game. And that whole celebration of Minnesota last weekend was phenomenal. I think the best case scenario, we have to go down this rabbit hole. And people think, I'm gushing about Minnesota. I think people understand I'm not a fan of Minnesota. I think the best case scenario for Minnesota is for them to lose the Big Ten championship to Ohio State. They'll lose the Big Ten championship, and then that would give them an opportunity to play in the Rose Bowl against either Oregon or Utah. That'd be a huge moment for them. And I really hope we see Minnesota versus Utah or Minnesota versus Oregon in the Rose Bowl. I think, Utah would be a really, really fun matchup because you got this great defense at Utah. They run the ball well against Minnesota, who plays great sound. I mean, really, Utah and Minnesota are both such similar teams where they play sound football. They're well coached. They're very disciplined. They run the ball well, and they have two interesting quarterbacks. I think Oregon would be a little more of a runaway. I think Oregon has a better chance to beat Minnesota. But either way, either matchup, it would be so much fun to watch Minnesota on a grand stage against Utah or Oregon. That's what I hope for their program. That's what I hope to see. And I think that's really the best case scenario for the University of Minnesota finishing this season. My name is Zach Schaumler. This is my podcast, Strong Opinion Sports. It's my favorite thing in the entire world. And I want to be very clear, open, and transparent. My YouTube channel is monetized. What that means is that some of my videos make money through ad revenue. Now, it's fewer than you think. A lot of my videos get claimed. But in the past, I've received donations from Patreon and PayPal. PayPal.me/Zach Schaumler. Patreon.com/Zach Schaumler. And so because I'm making ad revenue, it feels weird to just get donations. I wanted to give something back. I want to give people a reward for supporting me on Patreon. So now you can submit questions. If you give me $1 a month, you can submit questions to a pool of questions on Patreon. I look at all the questions on Patreon. I use my eyeballs. I make a joke about it. And I pick the top couple questions at the end of every single episode, and I read them and answer them on a segment called Ask Zach. Now, that's for people who have money. They want to support me. If you have no money to give, I totally understand. I've been a broke college kid myself. But if you believe in me and if you believe in my dream and you still want to help me, please help me grow by telling your friends about the show. Share it on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, maybe a screenshot of it. You put it on your Instagram story. Help me grow by telling your friends about the show. My name is Zach Schaumler. Thank you so very much, and have a great day.